The Call of the Breach, Part 3.
DisastrousInvolvedI.
Splashes of mud kicked up from the tires of our convoy as we rolled through the palisade gates of Ark River. The last of the sunset clung to the distant hills, but the air would likely remain in the cool mid-50s until dark, a nip to the breeze that heralded colder times ahead. Already the crop fields around the fortress had been stripped clean, the corn stubble and wheat chaff all that remained of the vast yellow oceans of grain. Gardens lay barren as well, the vegetables canned in glass jars or repurposed beer bottles, the pumpkins, berries, and other fruits packed away. Smoke rose in the air from multiple chimneys, the scent of cooking food heavy on the breeze, and as the first buildings of the settlement rolled by, I found myself lost in thought. After the firebombing of New Wilderness, we'd retreated across the ridgeline into the Southlands to link up with our allies from Ark River. Tucked within the ridgeline's protective embrace, the congregation had built a fortress town around their tiny church, scavenging seed, livestock, and tools from local abandoned farms. They'd kindly taken us in, let us raise cabins for our people within their walls, and pooled their supplies with ours. Their warriors served beside our rangers, they allowed the devout among our ranks to worship with them, and their stable masters even taught our soldiers how to ride the large bone-faced whitetail that they domesticated like horses. Despite all this, however, many in our camp found it difficult to get past the starkest difference between them and us, one deeper than their Nordic-esque appearance and pseudo-medieval fashion sense. At one time, nearly all of the people in Ark River hadn't been human. They waved as we drove in, their bright smiles and fair skin almost as vivid as their golden hair. Many were hard at work, tending to animals, weaving on big wooden looms in front of their respective cabins, or splitting firewood for the long winter ahead. A dozen shepherds worked to herd a large flock of sheep into their fold on the far side of the fort, and more of them fired arrows at straw targets on the opposite side of the road. The rifle range closed down for now as ammunition needed to be conserved. But it was at the end of the lane, at the old cemetery next to the white-clabbered church, where the largest crowd of them gathered. I heard the first scream before I even saw it and shuddered despite myself. Whoa. From his seat behind the wheel of the battered semi-truck, Charlie stared with blatant shock, eyes on the road. Throwing him a tired shake of my head, I pointed forward. It's nothing to concern yourself with. They're fine. Truth be told, even after all this time, the redemption ceremony that gave the Ark River folklife still made me feel uneasy. The unnerving screams of pain and shock. The crying and weeping, the pale nude figures that broke from their charcoal black cocoons to emerge into the world fully grown, it burned itself into my mind with photographic clarity. In my head, I could smell the sour brownish-black grease, heard the crunch as the cocoons splintered apart, and see the relieved faces of the onlookers as they swooped in to embrace their new kin. They couldn't help it, I knew that. Who could change how, where, or when they were born after all? We were birthed from blood and tissue, they began life somewhere else, somewhere deep within the void from whence all the mutants came, formed from mud and rot, nightmarish to behold. Only the sunlight could change them. Turn them into people who could speak, think, and love as we did. You'd think they were killing them. Lucille craned her neck from the armored compartment behind me to peer through a firing slot cut into height of the semi's cab. I looked down at my grubby hands, and tried not to see the milky white eyes, peg-toothed grins, and gray faces of the puppets as they chased me through the darkness of my dreams. You screamed too when you were born but had the privilege of being too young to remember, birth to parents who loved you, with a childhood to explore the world. They get none of that, they wake up drowning in those shells, and have to claw their way out, fully aware of what is happening. No family, no memories, just sudden raw existence. As we rumbled past, a familiar blonde woman looked back from the crowd to see us, and waved to me with a smile that was half joyous, half apologetic. She still didn't have much of a roundness to her belly yet, the baby not far along, but the girl never missed a redemption ceremony for her people, the event too important to forego. Wife to the leader of their order, and matriarch to all the women born from the redemption, Eve was a symbol of how badly the Ark River folk wanted to continue their race in the natural way, as the numerous married couples amongst them showed. In that way, they'd been fortunate, or blessed as she often said. With dozens of the women now expecting, though this number was still rather small given that they numbered close to 700 by now. Pregnancy rates were rising, but I could tell in the way Eve's husband spoke every time I saw him, with lines on Adam's forehead and creases in his smile, that it wasn't as fast as he'd hoped. They suffered casualties just the same as our rangers did whenever a patrol ran into mutants or else mercenaries, and being able to replenish their losses weighed heavily on their patriarch's mind. Sooner or later, we're going to run out of puppets to convert, right? Then what? How many of them will remain, and for how long? I swallowed, tasted a hint of the stench on the air, and itched at the silvery tattoos that stretched from my right arm up to my shoulder, mostly hidden by my uniform jacket. The breach spewed mutants, but strangely enough, didn't seem to affect humans in any noticeable way. I, however, had run afoul of a new enemy, one that lurked in the forests and swamps around us like a demon from the old stories, Vesitorak. With an army of intelligent mutants at his back, he set out to conquer our world for the breach, and a wound he'd given me had nearly brought about my death. Only by Jamie's rash action had I been saved, But it was this decision that doomed her, looking down at my faint surgical scars, concealed by the swirling flower-and-vine silver ink. I fought a wave of melancholy that rose in my throat like bile. Technically, I wasn't human either, not anymore. My genes had fused with the mutation brought on by Vesitorax's blade, and in that way, I was adrift between the golden-haired people that crawled from the dark, and my own kind who came from a mother's womb. Though I'd come to terms with it in the past few weeks, it was lonely at times when the stares came, the others eyeing my tattoos that spread over the right side of my face and around that same eye socket, visible only when the light caught my skin in a certain angle. To them, I was just as strange and cryptic as our new allies, like something from a children's story. A myth, a fairy of the gloom. It would have been unbearable without Chris by my side. He stood waiting for me as we pulled into the motor pool area, a makeshift cluster of shed-like buildings that had been erected to house our repair equipment and the mechanics. Like me, Chris wore a buckskin-colored jacket over his new green coalition uniform, with a rough pair of blue jeans that ended just over his boots. His short mousy hair fluttered in the cool November breeze, the color of maple syrup, and those familiar blue eyes lit up as I stepped out of my truck, a handsome smile crawling across his stubble-covered face. "Charlie, take charge of the platoon and unload the gear. I'm going to report to the major." I grabbed my Type 9 and turned to catch Lucille's eye. "You head straight to medical to have that head looked at, okay?" Lucille folded her arms with a slight frown but let out a huffy sigh of defeat. "Yes, ma'am." Each of the trucks rolled to a stop, and I swung the semi-door open to clamber down into the cold embrace of autumn. "Good to see you still in one piece, Lieutenant." Chris stood with both hands on his narrow hips, but I could sense the relief in his voice as I walked up to meet him. Though from the radio traffic, I heard it was a near-run thing. "You all right?" "Better now that I'm here," I let out a long sigh, my shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't been able to while we were outside the protective walls of Ark River. "Campbell probably has a concussion, but no one died, so that's a plus." We ran into a herd of autostockers, all sunlight adapted, and they nearly pushed us off the road. Things got messy. Chris's smile faded somewhat, and he nodded at the two up-armored pickup trucks that had arrived after the fact to escort us back to the Citadel. Counting the brain shredder our fishermen spotted on the eastern shore, and the albino fire drakes near Collingswood, that's 3 times in the last week. They're getting more numerous. We're going to have to send out escorts even in broad daylight from now on. There's more. Hefting my submachine gun sling on one shoulder, I followed him into the mechanical barn. And up a set of wooden steps to the second-story loft where small apartments had been made for both rangers and workers who didn't yet have tents or cabins. I found something. Or, rather, someone found me. At that, Chris froze and narrowed his eyes at me with a concerned frown. "Someone?" Nervous, I juggled the small knapsack I took on patrols in my arms, and glanced over my shoulder to be sure no one was listening. Vesitorax. His cheekbones drained of color, and Chris's jaw worked in tense unease. The last time I'd run into the dark creature, Chris had almost lost me, and a hatred burned in his sapphire irises that would have scared me if I weren't so exhausted. Looking both ways down the cramped rough-sawn hallway, Chris ushered me into the small, cozy office he occupied as head ranger, and locked the door behind us. Before I had a chance to say anything, 2 muscled arms wound around me, and Chris pulled me tight to his chest. "Oh, yes please." Leaning into the embrace, I shut my eye to savor the scent of his clothes, the faint leftover aroma of his chocolate cologne still clinging to the t-shirts he wore under his uniform. I slid both palms flat against his chest, relished the solid wall of muscle beneath the homespun cloth, powerful, and yet always gentle for me. If the fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty of the field had left me drained, this lit a fire inside my core, oozing gooey lava that I wanted to bask in for the rest of my life. We didn't get much time to ourselves now that he led the entire Ranger faction and I commanded a platoon of my own, but in the moments we could find, I tried to make the most of it. Our conversations had become even more serious in the past few days, and Chris once surprised me by asking if I would say yes to a ring, should he manage to procure one. At first, I thought he was joking, but there had been no jest in those amazing pools of blue that locked me in place every time they landed on my gaze. Chris had been serious, and I'd gone to my tent that night with visions of matrimony dancing in my head. However, as I stood there, I couldn't help but notice a slight tremor in his embrace. A fierceness in the strength that seemed to border on mournful. It was as if Chris braced himself against a strong breeze, like something loomed in the horizon he didn't want to acknowledge but was powerless to escape. "You okay?" I whispered and angled my head back to press my lips to his rugged jawline, something that always drove him up a wall in our limited private time. He kissed my forehead, but I noted how he didn't look right at me, the normal enthusiasm not sparking to life at my advances. "I'm fine, Pragtij. Just tired." "Now, what's this thing you wanted to show me?" "You have never been too tired to get hot and bothered." Maybe too old-fashioned to go all the way, but never too tired. What's gotten into you? Still unconvinced of his behavior, I shrugged it off to open my knapsack and lay the book on his desk. The two of us glared down at the mold-covered pages with quiet discomfort, and I swallowed a sour-tasting lump in my throat. In the yellow glow of a kerosene lamp, it looked even worse. Black vines snaked through the paper in ways that were eerily familiar to me, and the words written in blood stood out like they were painted in fire. So, I take it this is from him? Chris watched the book like it would jump up and bite him, a nasty undertone to his words that bespoke the visceral disgust he had for the odd forest necromancer, wrapping both arms around myself. I felt a chill move through my bones in spite of the warm room. We got into a bind. I couldn't fight, so I had to use my scream to chase the mutants away. He just walked up, put this in my lap, and left. I didn't even see him, couldn't so much as open my eyes. Chris ran his fingers through the brown hair on his scalp and cocked his head to one side. That doesn't make any sense. He wanted to assimilate you into his army, that much we know, so why not take the opportunity right then and there? If he risked appearing that close to daylight, then it all had to be for a reason. I bit my lip and wrinkled my nose at the rotted book. I think it's a final warning, a way for him to say that he's close to victory. Whatever he's after, Besatorak must be confident that he's got it, otherwise why give me this at all? We've kept him close for this very reason, and I think it's time to hunt him down, as soon as possible. My boldness surprised even me, and it took me a second or two to catch my breath. So far, I often helped add to plans, maybe give opinions on them when major decisions came, but I never made them from the start all by myself. It seemed bizarre that I'd come to the point where I was openly advocating to march to war against some mutated freak with his own army, and it only cemented the fact that my old self was as distant as my cozy suburban home in Kentucky. I wish it was that simple. Chris's face glowed for a brief second with an approving half-smile, but it faded into another grim expression of dread just as fast. Sean told all the faction leaders to keep this quiet, but I figure you ought to know, Jamie's trial got moved up to this evening. What? I stared at him, too stunned to speak, my skin clammy. He didn't wait for me to find words, and scratched the back of his neck, a sad, worn-out slump to his broad shoulders. He knows we have to turn the tide against Elsa soon, or we'll be stuck here all winter with the breach. At the rate it's spitting out more aggressive mutants, and with the Mold King out there building his army, we might not make it to spring if that happens. They're thinking about using the nukes. It had been the old head ranger, Rodney Carter, who discovered Silo 48, another strange apparition of the breach that had somehow been dragged from another distant reality into our own. Buried beneath thick concrete blast doors, a complete set of nuclear missiles waited to be roused from their mechanical slumber, and as we had both launch keys, that power was within our grasp. I'd unearthed the entrance myself, seen the rockets firsthand, and the thought of them marching skyward made my chest tighten. Just one of those things could wipe Black Oak off the map. We can't use them. Who knows how many civilians we'd kill, pacing back and forth. I tried to make sense of the impending situation. But Sean has got to know Jamie will be found guilty. She's one of his best rangers, how could none of us have a choice? Chris stalked across the room to slouch onto a small couch that had been scavenged from a nearby abandoned farmhouse. Since Ark River took us in, we have to mesh their governance system with ours. Adam and Eve have been incredibly tolerant of our assembly meeting in their sanctuary, but they've had people killed because of what happened at New Wilderness. Somebody has to pay the price, and this is their house, so Adam will be the judge, with Eve as his advisor, while Sean and the rest of us man the prosecution. But you have a veto. I threw my arms into the air, anger and indignation rising at the fast-tracking of my best friend's slaughter. Under our assembly you have the right to say if there is a trial or not as head ranger. They can't just, Hannah. He leaned forward to rest both elbows on his knees, and Chris rested his deeply lined forehead in one hand. I'm her defense. All the indignation came to a screeching halt within me, and I noticed how his stubble looked thicker than usual, his face gaunt, the dark circles under Chris's eyes evidence that he hadn't been sleeping as much as he claimed. I wondered if he'd taken enough time to get his share of the rations ladled out in the mess tent every day. And I knew him well enough that it was very possible Chris hadn't. He's running himself ragged, trying to handle all this on his own. Stubborn man. Jamie was right about him being hard-headed. At my astonished silence, Chris rubbed his face and gestured at the locked office door, in the invisible direction of the Ark River Church. The agreement was we'd follow Ark River's judicial system, so I don't get a veto anymore. All us officials were supposed to be on the prosecution, but I told Sean I'd resign if he didn't let me represent Jamie on the stand. I know she will hate me for it, but otherwise she'll go without anyone to speak on her behalf. Weak with shock, I stumbled down onto the couch beside him and stammered. So, you've got a plan, right? I can testify, we can convince the others easily if they just listen. Jamie's not guilty, it's not the officials we have to worry about. Chris faced me, and there was no warmth, no wit, no playful gleam in his eyes. There will be a jury of 12 people, half New Wilderness, half Ark River, all randomly selected by a lottery. We have almost 1,000 people inside Theses walls now, Hannah, and 300 of them watched their home be blown to bits not a week ago. Did you know they almost rioted at the chow line today while you were on patrol? I guess some moron spread a rumor we were going to cut rations. Took half the ranger force to disperse them all. But the people are still angry. They haven't forgotten that we let the pirates off the hook when lots of people wanted to see them hang. If Jamie gets on that witness stand and confesses to working with Elsa, it won't matter why or how, they'll tear her apart out of spite. Desperate to wipe the stressed look off his face, I scooted closer to take one of his hands in mine with a gentle squeeze. But why the nukes? I don't see what that has to do with Jamie. Does Sean really want to drop a nuclear bomb on Black Oak? Chris gripped my hand tight and grazed his thumb over my scarred knuckles in appreciative reflection. We've been turning over every idea. The fact is, once we launch the first missile, Elsa will be able to trace it from orbit, even with the electromagnetic interference, and they'll find the silo. If we launch them all, we'd better be sure it stops them, or there's no way Caranti would hold back after that. But he's got money, men, and materials spread all over the country, maybe even the world. I don't think we have enough warheads to cripple Elsa for good. Which means we have a very expensive, very deadly set of paperweights in that stupid concrete tube. Disappointed, I lay my head on his shoulder and chewed the inside of my lip and thought. But there's got to be something we could do. What about a demonstration strike? You know, blow up some trees somewhere just to let them know what we're capable of? Then they'll know where the silo is and throw every thing they have at it. Chris reclined in the love seat to nudge me closer and stroked my tangled hair in long, light touches that made pleasant shivers run down my back, even if we threaten to drop a warhead on Black Oak if they do? I looked up from his shoulder, exasperated. He smiled down at me with a dry, cynical grimace that bore no joy. They don't live here, Hannah. Their families are far away, in some other town that doesn't even know we exist, so what does it matter if a few thousand random civilians get incinerated? The moment Caranti knows we have the nukes, he'll get on a jet or helicopter and be gone. If we level Black Oak, all that will do is free up Elsa to dedicate their energy to killing us instead of protecting the local populace. I picked at a button on his uniform front in disappointment. So, if we shoot, we're screwed, and if we don't shoot, we're screwed. Pretty much. Chris waved toward a topographical map stretched across the wall next to his desk. That's why Sean's pushing for a conventional ground offensive. If we can hit them hard enough, maybe we can force Caranti to come to the negotiating table. At that point, we could use the nukes as bargaining power, since he still wouldn't know where they are. My mind a whirlpool of anxious thoughts, I scanned the map with idle skepticism from the couch. You think that will work? His body tensed under my arms, and Chris seemed to stare right through the faded paper map. His expression stony. I think whatever we do, thousands of innocent people are going to die, and it won't change anything. As you've seen, Vesitorak is still out there, and our scouts have been finding more signs of his army in the north and south. I reckon he's biding his time, waiting until either the war or winter makes us too weak to fight back. Exactly why I need to find a way to kill him. Sitting upright, I nodded. So, we take him out first. That's what I've been saying from the beginning. If there's enough of us, Vesitorak can't fight us all. Maybe, maybe not. I was there last time, Hannah. He nearly wiped out our convoy, and almost killed you. The fingers of his free hand brushed at the clasp on his pistol belt in idle reflex. And Chris seemed lost in dismal thought. Peter shot him point blank, and if that didn't bring him down, I'm not sure what will. Smoothing one palm over his broad chest in a bid to bring something like a smile back to his worried face, I raised one curious eyebrow. You still think we can negotiate a peace deal? He shrugged with melancholy hope, and the arm around my shoulders drew tighter. I want to believe it's possible, Pragtij. The sooner we end the war, the better. But I've been thinking about beyond that, about what happens after. After? To be honest, I hadn't thought of it for a while now. Day in and out, I'd been so focused on survival that the prospect of a peaceful future rarely occurred to me. I guess we'd leave. I mean, we can't stay here. But Chris studied the map on the wall before him with a newfound gleam in his eye, like the flicker of an idea rested just on the edge of his mind. Why not? How sleep-deprived are you? I blinked, unsure if this was some sort of murky joke or not. Are you serious? Chris, this place is full of monsters. There are things out there that hunt us like rabbits. We've got no gas stations, no internet, we don't even have indoor plumbing anymore. And yet here we are, still alive. He turned to me, a fierceness in his expression that both startled and intrigued me. Hannah, we have an opportunity here that no one has had for 200 years. The whole world doesn't know this place exists. Which means if we win this war, it's ours, all ours. To do what with? I wound my fingers up in the lapel of his shirt, doing my best to act coy, but in secretly hanging on his every word. Chris sat up straighter, his energy returned, a new zeal alight inside him. Start over. A new country, a new civilization, from the ground up. There's still enough people here to repopulate without a genetic bottleneck, and with Black Oak intact we could reinstate the Constitution, overhaul the power grid, activate some of the old oil pumps and refine the crude. We could get the cars running, clear the roads, build small forts in the countryside to protect the farms. No more politicians in DC telling us what to do. No more men like Karanti running our lives, just us in the wilderness like it was always meant to be. We could be free, Hannah, truly free for the first time in a century. What about your house? Doing my best not to get too swept up in the idea right away, I remembered some of the things he'd told me of his old life before Barron County, of a house he'd almost managed to pay off before Elsa shot him down inside the county lines. What about my parents? Chris, I get what you're saying, but if we stay, we might never see any of it again. His eyes bored into mine with laser-like intensity, and I saw longing there, so deep and wild that it made my heart skip a beat. I know. But I'm starting to wonder if we'll get that option regardless. Elsa is weak enough we might be able to push them out of the north, but they have too many units on the border for us to evacuate everyone. If we want to leave, it would mean a small amount of us escaping, while the others are left behind. Which is unacceptable. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, and I wrestled with my own wonder at his idea. Could we really build a new country all our own, on the ashes of what the breach had destroyed? Could we not only survive here, but thrive, and raise children in a world where monsters existed outside of our nightmares? Anyone that came after us would never know the amazing technology we'd grown up with. The vast knowledge of the internet, the glittering amusement of video games, or the sumptuous delights of easy modern cuisine. At the same time, if Kais was right, if somehow we could win this war, then our sons and daughters could live a life without being shackled to a bureaucratic parody of civilization, a world without crushing taxation, chemical-laden food, or the constant vitriol of modern politics. Sure, it wouldn't be perfect by any means, and would still be fraught with danger, but they could truly choose their own destiny, unlike the sterile, pre-packaged urban cattle chute that I'd grown up in. They could be happy, healthy, free. Jamie's not free. If we don't figure things out, she never will be. And it's all my fault. I bit my lip and hung my head with an anxiety-fueled sigh. So, what do we do about the trial? He looked down at his hands, and I thought I saw him grimace. I'm going to go talk to Lonson right now. Try to discuss some kind of legal strategy. In the meantime, why don't you? I'll come with you. Surging to my feet, I scooped my knapsack from the floor beside his desk. Chris shook his head, rising to walk to the door on his own. It's better if you don't. She's my friend. I slung my Type 9 over one shoulder and crossed my arms, refusing to give in. And I'm the one who got Peter and his crew taken off death row. This is my fault as much as hers. Pausing at the door handle, he watched me for a long while, and something in his gaze seemed to struggle, like Chris wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. We'd only grown closer in the tumult of the short time he and I had known each other in this vast wilderness, but sometimes it seemed Christopher Decker could still be so far away from me. Part of me assumed that a good day's rest, some food, and maybe some generous affection on my part could help mitigate it, but I had the sneaking suspicion that Jamie's ordeal likely weighed on him in more ways than I could know. They had been more than friends once before, and while I trusted him with all my heart, I knew bonds like that didn't just fade away. If it hurt me to know Jamie Lonson stood on the knife's edge of being condemned, I could only imagine what it was doing to the man who had broken her heart. Okay. The ghost of an appreciative smile flitted over his handsome face, and Chris held the door for me with his typical chivalric bow. "Why don't you bring the book, and we can ask her opinion on it? Besides, she might actually eat something if you're there." As I strode across the room to follow, I looked down at the book Vesitorak had given me and tried not to think about the hushed whispers in the corners of my ears that sprang up at doing so. My world, as messed up as it was, had been inverted once again. We stood poised on the brink of annihilation. Either from Elsa, Vesitorak, or our own hidden weapons. Yet Chris's words gave me a glimmer of hope that I wanted to cling to so badly, even if I doubted they were possible. Our own country. We could build that library he wanted, save so many lives, live in peace at last. Imagine how proud Mom and Dad would be if they could see it. Shaking my head at myself, I snatched the cursed book from the desk to shove it into my knapsack so the whispering would stop. It thumped against my back as I plunged out the door after Chris into the dim, brown corridor made from old plywood and rough sawn lumber, our boots echoing on the creaky floorboards. Even from inside the hastily built structure, I could feel the cold November air creeping in, winter so close I could taste the snow on the breeze. The heady aroma of sawdust, motor oil, and wood smoke from nearby conjured bittersweet sensations in my heart, musing at how much longer this place would know the trademark sense of mankind. We were running out of time, not just as individuals but as a species, and I prayed that somehow, we could find a way to rescue both Jamie and Barron County.